I'd consider Adeptus Mechanicus the main army I collect, and it started as a chance to use their units to kitbash and convert more, which I'd say has gone pretty well so far. It's now turned into a long-term project of wanting to have an entire army of custom minis. So I was pleasantly surprised when the new AdMech minis were announced, and I knew I needed to build some myself to keep up with my AdMech army project. Of the new releases, it made the most sense to start with a new squad of Hastari. They're a new addition to the Hastari legions, but on the bulkier side than what we've seen from them before, carrying some bigger weapons. Basically some new heavy Hastari infantry. The box has two versions of them, Fusiliers or Exterminators, but I've never been limited by what the instructions tell you to make before, so I'll be seeing what other simple variants I can come up with by combining these new parts with ideas and bits from other AdMech units. When I first saw the designs for the Hastari, with their large chest piece, it reminded me of some original Hastari art by John Blanche, so I decided to take a few other design elements from that piece for the first unit I built, using the squad leader to make a Hastari Ranger. For the bigger parts of the build, aside from the obvious Hastari Ranger head, there's the rotary cannon left arm, which I used the gun from the Blackstone Fortress UR-025 model. There's also the bladed claw style of right arm, which I used a sword hand from Sicarians for. Instead of the Hastari's normal small shoulder gun, I made a small weapon arm using a Cataphren limb and a Hastari phosphor blaster. I couldn't fit it to come out of the cloak like the original art, so in the end I settled on mounting it on the lower side of the power pack. Then for some minor details, I added 2 side magazines to the big gun, which I got from the Sicarian kit, and to copy a few more elements from Hastari Rangers, I put a power pack camera on one shoulder and replaced one of the power pack pylons with an antenna also from the Sicarian kit. For the second Hastari, I wanted to try something along the lines of a battle servitor. I swapped the head for a servo skull, specifically a slightly bigger and meaner looking one from the Tech Priest Dominus. To give it some big robotic arms to lean into the top heaviness of the Hastari, I grabbed a pair of arms from the Cataphren kit. They were both left arms, so I did need to adjust one by cutting it at a few joints to rotate and reassemble it. And while I was at it, I replaced the claw with a power fist taken from some Titanicus scale Questoris Knights. Not wanting its loadout to stray too far from the original Hastaris, I mounted one of the guns on its shoulder by drilling holes to connect it to its power pack. Then to cover up the removed smaller gun mount, I added a cable port taken from a Hastari power pack, to which I just glued in a bit of 1mm wrapped wire from Zinja Industries. For at least one of the Hastari, I wanted to try a bit of a bigger change, removing the coat like I've done with some Hastari before, and maybe changing the legs. The unit's very hunched over posture and legs that are missing chunks that are normally covered by the coat means it's hard to do anything else without changing the whole lower body. But fortunately I had most of the arms and legs spare from a UR-025, which I previously used the torso on a Cataphren gun tank and its gun on the earlier Hastari Ranger, so with those leftover bits I could turn this into a Hastari automata, totally not a man of iron in disguise. To connect the limbs, I did need to make a new hip and waist section, as well as trim the sides of the Hastari chest a little and make new shoulder connections. For this I used some 2mm plastic rod and the base of a Cataphren gun for a waist. Along with those, a Sicarian infiltrator's head helps keep the very robotic theme going. Since I did use the robot's rotary cannon previously, it was a good chance to swap in one of the Hastari's weapons that I just trimmed down and also connected with some more plastic rod. That worked for the rough idea of the model, but it did need a little cleaning up and detailing. The final head was the top half of a Sicarian infiltrators with the bottom half of a proper Hastari head. I replaced the sub-weapon on the right arm with one of the Hastaris. I added some waist armour, some from the normal Hastari waist with some from a Cataphren, and I also detailed the leg and arm connector rods with smaller plastic rods and some 1mm wrapped wire from Zinja Industries. One AdMech unit I like, but don't often do much with, is the Secutari Hoplight. I'm a big fan of the sci-fi take on ancient warriors, but their resin parts aren't as easy to work with as plastic, and they're better used sparingly as they come at the Forge World premium costs. However, the new Hastari parts seemed like a good opportunity for a heavy Secutari. The general idea was for a Hastari hoplight, a big spear and shield unit that could form a strong phalanx in groups. So I grabbed an electric spear piece from an Attilan Rough Rider and used that in place of one of the Hastari weapon barrels, like a small version of the lance-type weapon that Imperial Knight Lancers and Destries have. I could use a proper Secutari head, but the shield would need to be a little bigger, so I tried to make one myself. I started with some plasticard with the rough shape sketched on. I glued on a few pieces of Cataphren tread armour, cut out a chunk for the head and shoulder weapon, then detailed it with a few smaller parts, like more Cataphren armour, a circular piece from an Electro Priest's back, more plasticard for detail on the back, as well as some Cataphren claws so it can dig into the ground for a stronger defence. I added a few Cataphren arms to the unit's power pack to hold the shield, and that was the main build for the Hastari hoplite for now. For the final Hastari, I opted for a style like that of Cataphrons and the old Myrmidons, a mobile weapon platform that just so happens to be built around a person. Like the previous Hastari automaton, I did need to use 2mm plastic rod for some of the inner parts of some connections. On its left side, I used one of the smaller Cataphren weapon arms, with the gun swapped for one of the Hastari's smaller ones, and for the right side, I used one of the Cataphren weapon mounts. There's a large range of options for big weapons to attach here, from Cataphrons, Hastari themselves, Thalax, or the bigger Skitarii guns, but I opted for one from a Tech Priest Manipulus, and filled an open space in the connection with 2mm wrapped wire. But this Hastari destroyer build, like the previous units, was still missing something. If you'll notice all the holes drilled in places, I put those there for the next step of detailing, adding a number of green stuff wires to connect everything up, fill space, and maybe cover a few mistakes too. Unfortunately, this time a new batch of green stuff I tried to use didn't behave like I was used to, and I had less to work with than expected. So I also used some different sizes of Zinj Industries wrapped wire, as well as plain 1mm aluminium wire to compensate. I linked up all the holes I drilled in the destroyer, as well as added a lot to the gun to emphasise that it would need a lot of energy from the power pack. I similarly hooked up the guns on the battle servitor and automata, then also filled in an empty spot on the hoplite shield. Then I also built the bases, starting with adding a layer of textured plasticard, cut to match the shape of the base, which I detailed with spare wire, whatever leftover bits I had to hand, and they'd also get a bit of texture paste later. One final building thing to note is that I left all the legs and torsos unglued for now, just to make it easier to reach the insides of the cloaks and parts of the base, to help myself with the painting later. That completed the building of this squad, so I could move on to painting it in my Admech's grey and orange scheme. I started by priming it with the Chaos Black spray, and to set it up with a nice metal base, I heavily dry brushed some Iron Warriors, followed up by a lighter dry brush of Two Thin Coats' plate armour for some rough highlights. For the robes and some of the armour panels, I used Mechanicus Standard Grey. For the inside of the cloaks and some wires, I used Ratskin Flesh. To pick out some metallic details, I used Balthazar Gold. Then for some other wires, I used Corn Red and Cabalite Green, which I also used for various buttons and dials on the power packs. Then to base coat some optics and energy weapon sections, I used Celestra Grey. I added some decals from the Admech transfer sheet, mostly just for squad markings, which I applied over a bit of the gloss paint Ard coat to ensure they went on smoothly. Then once that dried, I went over them with some matte Lamium Medium. I coloured all the Celestra Grey parts with Athematic Blue for quick and simple glowing areas, and I also used that blue over a few other parts like the Power Pack energy coils for a duller blue tint. Sticking with the contrasts, I also used Black Templar to go over some wires and other silver parts to give them a darker finish. I also applied a bit of Pro Aquil's Grey Earth on some parts of the base, before moving on to shading the models. I used Agrak's Earthshade for all the orange and copper parts, then Nuln Oil for the silver and grey parts, and I also used a mix of the shades on the bases, after quickly dry brushing some Dawnstone on the Grey Earth for some easy highlights. Then it was almost finished and only final cleanup and highlights were left. I kept them simple, mostly just using the original base paints to brighten up the raised areas and edges of the minis, but I did go a shade brighter on the main colours. I used Two Thin Coats' plate armour for the silver, Dawnstone for the grey, and Hashwood Copper for the coppers. And that's how I made this Hastari squad, full of new variants based on the styles of existing, mostly AdMech minis. While the kit doesn't lend itself well to conversions that don't have the same hunched over posture, there's still many different ideas that can be worked in, and I'm very happy to add this batch to my growing army of fully converted AdMech minis. Of course, I'm also going to be trying out a build using the new Thulia Gold that released with the Hastari, but I'm not forgetting about my Black Templars either. For them, I'm putting my AdMech bits to good use and building a Tech Marine. If you want to keep up with those projects as I'm making them, I post my progress regularly on Instagram, Twitter, and a few other places, all linked in the description. I've also linked the main kits used in this build with my Element Games affiliate link, which is my own go-to for new full kits, cheaper than official Games Workshop prices. And if you want to support me more directly, I also have a Patreon, where I post project updates and plans, building tips for anyone to read, ideas for future projects, and you can even sometimes help me decide on what stuff I build next. A big thank you to those currently supporting me on Patreon, who are Kyra, Morse Going Free, Gamrus, The Lich's Laboratory, Nariko the Transbian Shark, Always Able, Quirky Perceptions, Darren, B-Dog, PP, Hosea, Yaroslav Altunin, and Glunky Lad.